On a frigid, wind-lashed morning of January 18, 1983, a quiet, unsettling call came into the police from a local businessman. He reported a maroon Cadillac abandoned in the parking lot of the Varnus Boat Club in Sheepshead Bay, Brooklyn. It had lingered there for over a week, forgotten and suspiciously unattended. The police had already inspected the car once, finding no signs of theft and deciding to leave it untouched, expecting its owner to return. But as days passed without a trace, the unease grew. Persuaded by the club manager's insistence, the police agreed it was time to take another look. This time, they decided on a thorough investigation. News of a local missing person report had surfaced a man whose wife had been searching for him for days. This car matched the description perfectly. Peering inside, the officers noted something chilling dark stains scattered across the seats. One officer climbed onto the rear bumper, testing the weight by jumping up and down. The way the car rocked led him to believe the trunk was empty, so they ordered it towed to the police garage. After 2 hours of warming the vehicle inside, forensic analysts pried open the trunk. What they found inside was startling: a chandelier, sprawled awkwardly across the trunk's floor. But there was more, a discovery far more sinister. Beneath the chandelier lay the body of a heavy-set, dark-haired man in his 40s, clearly dead from multiple gunshot wounds. The bitter January cold had locked his body in rigor mortis, his hand frozen in a final, futile gesture of defense over his face. His black leather jacket was twisted around his head, resembling a makeshift turban, while his torso clung, frozen, to the spare tire. A bullet had pierced his hand, now rigid and icy, and further examination would reveal the brutal nature of his death execution style, with a bullet behind each ear. Altogether, he'd been shot 7 times, left to rest in a pool of his own blood, now frozen solid. Later, when his son came to claim the car, he found that crime scene technicians had left behind scattered remnants, discarded glove papers soaking in the pool of blood, as though the once luxurious car had become a makeshift trash bin. In the back seat, a wire hinted at a missing recorder, and nearby lay a crumpled copy of New York Magazine, with a cover story focused on drug dealing, a detail recorded by reporters Gene Mustaine and Jerry Capisi in Murder Machine. There was little doubt among investigators this was a professional hit, staged to ensure the body would be found. The chances of catching the killer, or killers, were slim. Yet, in a twisted sense, the victim had set himself on this path of fate that often befalls those who tread too closely with the wrong kind of people. On the morning of January 10th, around 9:30, this man left home, mentioning an appointment later in the day to review some legal papers. His daughter's birthday party was set for that evening, and he promised his wife he'd be there. He never missed a birthday. But that day, he never came back. The family's missing person report eventually led police to the grim discovery inside the car. 8 days passed before they received the devastating news he had been executed, his body locked away in the trunk. His 17-year-old son broke down in disbelief, but his wife remained stoic, arranging for his burial at St. John's Cemetery on Long Island. Years passed before the full story emerged, pieced together from 2 perspectives: a son who sensed his father's deepening troubles, and an insider familiar with the gang responsible for his death. Today, the life of Roy DeMeo is documented primarily in 2 accounts: Murder Machine and Albert DeMeo's For the Sins of My Father. Each reveals a different side of the man known as one of the Mafia's most ruthless enforcers, allegedly responsible for orchestrating up to 200 killings. How does a man go from a position of power and fear within one of New York's infamous crime families to ending up in the bloody trunk of his own car, lying beneath a shattered chandelier? Roy Albert DeMeo's story began in 1942, born to a working-class Italian family in Brooklyn. Like many teens in the 1950s, especially those from modest backgrounds, he sought ways to earn fast money. Spending time with the sons of Mafia boss Joseph Profacchi, Roy was introduced to the shadowy world of loan sharking. In this underworld, those with cash lent it to people banks wouldn't touch, charging sky-high interest in return. At first, Roy's job was simple: collect the weekly payments from local businesses. But soon, he learned to make the loans himself, diving deeper into the web of organized crime and absorbing the ways of the Southern Italians who had made New York their new domain. Southern Italian men, as Howard Obadinsky details in Organized Crime, had crafted a strict code, a set of ideals that fueled their ambitions in a world where they otherwise held little power. This code held that a true man never cooperated with authorities, kept his composure in adversity, avenged every insult to his family, and never forgot a slight. Trust was sacred and reserved only for family, sometimes even extending to the most distant relatives. Outsiders could be accepted into the family through rituals like godparenting. The patriarch held absolute power, deciding life and death, as well as which ventures the clan would pursue for profit. Leaders like Carlo Gambino and Paul Castellano banned drug dealing within the family, especially heroin, fearing the severe penalties would tempt dealers to become government informants. Those who ventured into forbidden activities like drug dealing risked becoming nothing more than a memory. As Richard Gambino explains in Blood of My Blood, every family member was accountable to the Capo di Famiglia. Their duty was clear: make the family, and especially the patriarch, wealthy, respected, and powerful. This duty extended to arranging strong marriages and forming honorable alliances, primarily among Sicilian families. Those who proved strong and relentless in serving the family's interests were rewarded with greater responsibilities. To maintain order and prevent vendettas over imagined insults, strict rules were put in place. Thus, even while operating outside the law, they saw themselves as men of honor, bound by a code that emphasized dominance, masculinity, and strength. When several families united or reached an understanding, one man emerged as the Capo di Tutti Capi, the boss of all bosses, to whom the others owed their loyalty and respect. The boss provided protection, employment, lawyers when arrests were made, financial support for families during prison sentences, and threats to keep business rivals at bay. In exchange, he took a share of everyone's earnings. All business passed through him, and he acted as the ultimate mediator in family disputes. As Nicholas Pileggi explains, among wise guys in organized crime families, a preference for crime over legitimate business grew strong. It simply paid better. In Wise Guy Life in a Mafia Family, he describes a world where crime was everywhere, and anyone who chose not to participate was merely prey. Living any other way was seen as naive. Easy money, especially when earned by outsmarting someone else, was considered the best kind. Young recruits often found their apprenticeships within neighborhood gangs, where they received assignments, proved their worth, and began to climb the ranks. As a teenager, Roy DeMeo might have chosen a different path. His mother dreamed he'd become a doctor, but loan sharking offered quick, easy money, and he had a knack for it. He felt no hesitation in using violence against those who didn't pay on time, seeing it as simply part of the job. Captivated by the gleaming Cadillacs driven by local gangsters, Roy made his choice. It wasn't long before he crossed paths with members of the Gambino crime family. Led by Carlo Gambino, this powerful syndicate included around 250 men and hundreds of associates, controlling a vast criminal empire across New York. Roy was determined to join, and he quickly proved his worth as a soldier under the command of Anthony Nino Gaggi. The more cash Roy funneled to Nino from his earnings, the more Nino could pass up the chain to his superiors. Nino held influence, and Roy had the talent to bring in money, making them a powerful duo. Nino Gaggi was shaped by the ruthless, cutthroat world of Manhattan's Lower East Side, where he quickly learned that survival belonged to the fittest. In this world of racketeers, power brought rewards often displayed in material wealth, sharp suits, and polished appearances. Beneath the tailored clothes and silk ties, however, was a willingness to do whatever it took to climb higher in the family hierarchy. Standing at 5 and weighing 160 pounds, Nino was a scrappy fighter who seized his first big opportunity through his father's cousin, Frank Scalise. Scalise, a loan shark with powerful connections, served as an underboss for Albert Anastasia and entrusted Nino to manage a stolen car ring. In 1957, however, Scalise was assassinated while out buying fruit, reportedly for selling family memberships to line his own pockets. Soon after, 2 more soldiers from the same family were killed, including Scalise's own brother, igniting an underworld war. By the year's end, Albert Anastasia himself was murdered, leaving a power vacuum. Carlo Gambino, along with his cousin and loyal underboss, Paul Castellano, ascended to the top. Nino, who had proven his loyalty and resourcefulness, finally earned his status as a made man. To achieve the status of a made man in a crime family, two qualities were essential and had to be proven repeatedly. The first was the ability to make money. As one character in The Sopranos put it, "You're only as good as your last envelope." Proving one's worth meant not only filling the boss's pockets but also one's own. The second essential quality was the willingness to kill when required. Loyalty and trustworthiness were paramount. Family members had to maintain absolute silence about the family's secret operations. Breaking the code of silence was a death sentence. Yet people could be whacked on nothing more than suspicion or rumor. If someone wanted to take over another's business, all it took was a whisper that the target might be an informant or sowing dissent against the boss. People were killed for far lesser offenses, but Roy's actions were far from minor. At 32, living in a comfortable home in an upscale neighborhood with his wife and children, Roy committed his first murder for the family. Roy and Nino were running an extortion scheme targeting a profitable X-rated film business. When the business owner and his partner were raided and arrested, Roy feared one of them, Paul Rothenberg, might strike a deal with authorities, revealing ties to him and Nino. Roy arranged a meeting at a diner under the guise of offering help with legal expenses. But when they stepped out of their cars, Roy drew a silencer-equipped gun, led Rothenberg into an alley, and executed him with several shots to the head. Having grown accustomed to bullying others as a teenager, Roy had no qualms about issuing threats. Now, with his first kill behind him, murder became just another part of business, and it gave him a newfound sense of power. "Once you've killed someone," he later told his apprentices, "you can do anything with this mantra." Roy began training a crew of young men to kill on demand and dispose of bodies with speed and precision. Having once been a butcher's apprentice, he knew all too well how to dismember a body. One of DeMeo's first recruits was a 16-year-old named Chris Rosenberg, a Jewish kid who resented his heritage and longed to prove himself worthy of acceptance by the Italians. Roy met Chris in the Brooklyn neighborhood of Canarsie, where Chris was dealing pot. Roy saw potential and soon guided him into a more lucrative business, stealing cars and turning them into high-value exports for wealthy clients overseas. A car mechanic named Freddie Denome soon joined the crew. Two more recruits followed, high school dropouts Joey Testa and Anthony Senner. Roy also bought a share in Phil's Lounge, a bar in a two-story building that became his headquarters for illegal operations. One of his associates later renamed it the Gemini Lounge. Joey and Anthony quickly earned the nickname the Gemini Twins. Another young recruit, Henry Borelli, known for his cold-blooded nature, joined the crew, and the group began using the bar as their gathering place. There they socialized, planned their illegal operations, and handled more covert tasks. Roy also began amassing an arsenal, storing machine guns, automatic rifles, and silencers in a room at the lounge. Roy also moved his cousin, nicknamed Dracula, into the apartment next to the lounge. With a stomach for the grisly, Roy developed a unique method for disposing of victims, a technique that would become known as the Gemini method. He trained his crew in this approach, creating a systematic process for dismemberment. When someone needed to disappear, disposal often posed a challenge. Roy's method offered a solution. In Murder Machine, authors Mustaine and Capisi detail this process based on the confessions of Nino Gaggi's nephew, Dominic Montiglio. The target marked for elimination by someone higher up would be lured into DeMeo's Gemini Lounge, or in one instance, even into the meat department of a supermarket. Upon arrival, the target would be shot immediately by one of the crew members, often by Roy himself. Another crew member would wrap the body in a towel to contain the blood, then proceed to behead and dismember it. The body parts were then carefully packaged in plastic garbage bags, like pieces of meat, and discarded at a dump. It's no different than butchering a deer, Roy would tell his crew. Although a few female targets were executed, there's no record of any female dismemberment. Over time, however, this method of disposal needed refinement. The first attempt on a criminal car dealer turned informant in 1975 proved sloppy and careless. First, Chris, Joey, and Anthony used an attractive woman to lure Andre Katz, creating an unintended witness. They then brazenly grabbed him off the street, leaving his car abandoned and open, signaling a clear case of a missing person. Finally, they took Katz to a supermarket, where Roy awaited them. Roy laid out the plan, leaving them with a stark choice: follow through or walk away. It was a defining moment, testing if they could handle the gruesome task of dismembering a human body. On what Mustaine and Capisi later called the Night of the Knives, Chris took a butcher knife and plunged it repeatedly into the man's heart. The crew put on butcher's aprons and went to work, wrapping the dismembered body parts in green plastic bags. They then discarded the packages in a garbage bin, expecting it to be collected soon. However, they misjudged the timing, leaving enough of a gap for a foraging homeless man to uncover the grisly contents, exposing the body parts. The homeless man fled, but another passerby soon stumbled upon the horrific scene and contacted the police. Authorities recovered 8 carefully wrapped packages, though they never located the victim's genitals. Ironically, the coroner who examined and identified the remains turned out to be Roy's second cousin. The young woman who had unwittingly lured the victim read about his murder in the newspapers and decided to cooperate with the authorities. The police arrested 2 members of the crew, but there was no evidence linking them to Roy. He provided them with a lawyer, though they still ended up serving time. At trial, their lawyer successfully discredited the young woman's testimony, leading to the acquittal of the 2 crew members. To Roy's relief, he emerged from the incident unscathed. From that point on, with the exception of one victim left half decapitated in a motel room, the crew took extra precautions, personally transporting dismembered parts to the dump. Occasionally, bodies were buried beneath construction sites or sealed into barrels filled with concrete. However, the usual method remained the local garbage dump. These disappearances became frequent and systematic, with estimates suggesting that between 75 and 200 victims vanished within a decade. To those in the know, the 5 men who ran the disassembly line reportedly admitted they got a thrill out of it. As Mustaine and Capisi noted, the crew often claimed that killing gave them a feeling of godlike power. By 1976, DeMeo was 34 and had been grooming his killing crew for over a year. That same year, Carlo Gambino died, triggering a power shift that elevated Big Paul Castellano to the role of godfather. This power shift initially worked in Roy's favor, as Nino Gaggi, Castellano's closest ally, continued to advocate for him. Though Castellano distrusted Roy, seeing him as unreliable due to his Neapolitan background, Nino vouched for his loyalty and abilities. Determined to prove himself, Roy knew that achieving the status of a made man required bold actions to gain the family's attention. Earning money was essential, but Roy turned killing into such a grisly art form that even men of higher rank feared him. Rumors of his brutality reached Castellano, who grew concerned. He wanted no loose cannons in the family men who killed impulsively and jeopardized the organization. Castellano confided to Nino that he didn't want Roy to become a made member of the family. Unaware of this, Roy believed that increasing his financial contributions would earn him respect, so he intensified his illegal activities. He brokered deals with Irish gangs on the west side, securing 10% of their profits. Nino relayed this success to Big Paul, who couldn't help but be impressed. When the time came for Castellano to make changes to the family roster, Nino once again recommended Roy for made man status, though Paul initially refused. Eventually, however, he relented, swayed by Roy's skill in handling the troublesome West Side gang. At last, Roy DeMeo earned his button and officially became a member of the Gambino family. He swore allegiance to Omerta, the Sicilian code of silence, fully aware that this commitment was for life with no way out. Despite the family's strict ban, Roy continued dealing in drugs, drawing unwanted attention from the FBI. His notoriety as a killer intrigued federal agents, and this growing interest began to worry Paul Castellano. When Roy's crew murdered a man who had cooperated with a grand jury along with the man's young mistress, leaving both bodies in plain sight, Castellano realized Roy was taking matters into his own hands. These were unsanctioned killings, conducted without the family's approval, and Castellano feared there would be more. Yet Castellano was also dealing with issues of his own. With security breaches, rumors of made men wearing wires, and whispers within the family that his leadership was faltering, Big Paul found himself constantly on guard. The FBI was ever present, waiting for an opportunity to strike. We had what I believe was one of the first court-authorized video installations on an organized crime case recalled an FBI agent who had surveilled Castellano's operations. This was around 1975 or 76, as best as I recall the agent explained. We focused on Castellano's loan sharking operation and managed to install a hidden camera and microphones in their headquarters. Back then, there was no microwave transmission. We had to hardwire everything and monitor it from a nearby Catholic school. Each day, money flowed in from various collection points to their headquarters. We captured them on camera as they counted the cash, stacked it in piles, and cross-checked lists of who had paid and who hadn't. The agent continued. They'd even compromised a bank loan officer who ensured the paperwork was processed correctly for their clients' loans. Essentially, they were leveraging the bank's money to fund their loan sharking operation, skimming a cut off the top, while the bank typically got repaid. It was a profitable setup until Castellano began to withdraw from the social clubs, meeting with members less frequently. With no one reprimanding Roy for his actions, he expanded his crew and intensified their activities. The years from 1977 to 1979 marked the crew's most active period, with anyone who crossed them or tried to cheat on a deal simply vanishing. Even crew members weren't immune, and soon one of them, acting independently, found himself in serious trouble. Occasionally, Chris Rosenberg, who saw himself as Roy's protege, would even introduce himself as Roy DeMeo. Like Roy, Chris often ventured out on his own business deals. In 1979, a drug deal with a group of Cubans in Florida went sour, and Roy discovered that Chris had scammed them, using the DeMeo name as leverage. Chris had even claimed he had a powerful father in Brooklyn. 3 of the Cubans and 2 Jewish associates later went to New York and mysteriously disappeared. This meant that when the Cubans came seeking revenge on the man who had cheated them and possibly eliminated their associates, Roy's family would be directly in their crosshairs. To Roy, this was an unforgivable risk. Yet Chris was like a son to him, and when the Cubans revealed what would settle the score, Roy was taken aback. The Cubans demanded proof of Chris's death, asking for a public notice in the newspaper confirming it. If not, they warned, they would come after him themselves. Nino instructed his nephew to tell Roy to handle the matter, but Roy delayed for weeks, forcing the order to be repeated. Roy continued to stall, retreating into his home, gripped by paranoia that the Cubans would come after him. One day, he noticed a dark-haired young man sitting in a Cadillac outside his house, seemingly looking through some papers. Roy's wife, Gladys, mentioned that the man had come to the door earlier, claiming to be a vacuum cleaner salesman. To Roy, the story seemed suspicious. He was convinced it was just an excuse to confirm his residence. With the man still lingering in the neighborhood and appearing to be Hispanic, Roy decided it was time to take matters into his own hands to protect his family. Roy and a cousin armed themselves and stepped outside to confront the man. As Roy approached, the man looked up, quickly started his car, and drove off. Roy jumped into his own car, tailing him and firing shots as he sped after him. After a 7-mile chase, Roy finally caught up and shot the man 7 times, killing him instantly. He then rushed back home, gathered his wife and 3 children, and took them to a safe hideout. Only upon returning home did Roy learn the truth of what he had done. The man outside his house had been Dominic Ragucci, an 18-year-old college student legitimately selling vacuum cleaners door to door to pay for his education. Roy had made a tragic mistake. He quickly sold his Cadillac, and as his son Albert recounts in For the Sins of My Father, Roy broke down, grieving over the murder of an innocent young man. Killing rival soldiers, informants, or anyone who betrayed him was one thing, but this boy's death was different. Albert saw his father as a man capable of genuine care, and this mistake shattered him. Yet, even as Roy wrestled with his guilt, the unresolved matter of Chris Rosenberg lingered. Roy knew it was time to act. One night he gathered the crew, excluding Chris, and informed them that he would be the one to pull the trigger. He had introduced Chris to this life, and now it was his duty to end it. As difficult as it was, he understood it as part of the responsibility that came with being a made man. The incident unfolded on May 19, 1979. Roy called Chris to meet him, and when Chris arrived, he greeted Roy with a kiss on the cheek. In that moment, Roy shot him in the head. The rest of the crew completed the grim task, placing Chris's body in his car to ensure it would be found and reported. The killing of Chris settled the crisis with the Cubans, but a new problem quickly emerged. A family member reported to Castellano that Nino and Roy were involved in drug dealing. To silence him, Nino decided that the man and his son had to disappear. However, the plan was botched, leading to Nino's arrest while Roy managed to escape. The murders continued without pause, even after Nino was released on bail. Detectives started connecting some of the killings, and the crew began to unravel. Despite Nino's efforts to avoid conviction, he ultimately ended up in Attica prison. Nino appointed Roy as his stand-in, a decision that didn't sit well with Big Paul, who was increasingly weary of the endless killings. Nino couldn't yet see how this arrangement would ultimately lead to his own downfall. Meanwhile, crew members Henry and Freddie were arrested in connection with 2 murders and linked to a stolen car ring. Soon, other crew members found themselves under investigation as well. Nino's conviction was eventually overturned, allowing him to go free, but the FBI was tightening the noose, ramping up pressure on everyone from Paul Castellano down to the lowest ranks. The government had a powerful weapon in the RICO law, or Racketeering Influenced and Corrupt Organizations Act, enacted to go after mafia crime families. It allowed witness protection, wiretaps, and the power to impanel grand juries. The penalties for such criminal enterprises were stiff, even just for membership. Assistant U.S. Attorney Walter Mack took over the case, looking for anyone who would implicate Roy DeMeo in murder, and he was a bulldog. The task force kept pressuring Roy, who grew more agitated, just as they hoped. Finally, they got a break with the arrest of a crew member, Vito Arena, who began to roll at once. He described the murders in which he had been involved, and even showed investigators some of the body dump sites. Roy soon found out that Vito was a government witness, so he made himself scarce. The police delivered a grand jury subpoena to his home. Roy told Nino and Paul about Vito's defection, and Paul realized that Vito knew about him as well. Roy would have to go before a grand jury, and he could not be trusted. The FBI surveillance equipment picked up a conversation in which John Gotti was asked, on behalf of Big Paul, to accept a contract on Roy. Gotti declined, because Roy's gang was known to be dangerous. Big Paul finally ordered an end to those things that were getting them all into trouble, notably the drugs and the members who were acting out too much. He gave Nino the task of taking care of Roy DeMeo, as depicted in Boss of Bosses, saying that DeMeo loved killing too much. Nino had brought him into this life, in a way, so he would take him out. Roy's son, Albert, writes about how frightened his father was during those days, and how he would take his son aside to ask him to do things in preparation for Roy's sudden departure. Roy was thinking about going into the wind, as mobsters referred to being on the run, but he also realized that he might be killed. He'd brought trouble down on the family, and someone was going to end his connection with them, one way or another. He was right. Before the government could have their way, the family got him first. Albert DeMeo grew up with a fairly good idea of what his father was doing, although he was later shocked by photos he saw during a grand jury hearing, and by what he read in Munstane's and Capicci's book, Murder Machine. He once told a girlfriend that if she wanted to understand him, she should read about Michael Corleone in The Godfather. While his mother gave him a Bible to read, his father gave him Niccolò Machiavelli's political treatise, The Prince, seemingly the blueprint for the Italian underworld. Albert found the book fascinating. After serving 14 years as a secretary to the Second Chancery of the Signoria in the Florentine Republic, Machiavelli had fallen out of power in 1512. He wrote that religion and morals have no place in the rise to power. A prince cannot indulge in the virtues of goodness, because to hold power, he must be a lion and a fox. In other words, he must rely on such traits as cruelty, craftiness, mercilessness, and dishonesty. If necessary, he should not hesitate to break promises. He must ally himself with his own kind, choose wise counselors, and do whatever must be done in the name of power. The survival of the fittest was the ultimate game, and even the closest of alliances could be betrayed. Pulled into this world before he could understand it, Albert found himself torn between utter devotion to his father and disgust over what he was sometimes asked to do. At the age of 13, he was putting a gun in his backpack to go to school. He saw things but never imagined the extent to which his father was fully involved in crime, including multiple murders. In a literate memoir, Albert describes what it was like to grow up in a family where his father made a fortune through criminal ventures, and his mother, like many other wives in these families, allowed herself to be protected from knowing how she and her children were being supported in such a grand lifestyle. This was the way of the Mafia. The men engaged in their war, but the women were to be protected from knowing anything about it. In the end, this system inevitably broke down, since mobsters often shot those who made them paranoid or whom they felt had betrayed them, and it was difficult for the women to ignore the violence by which their husbands and sons had lived and died. The men seemed to want their families to exist in this pure arena, wherein they could view themselves as somewhat genteel. At home among family, they could forget their own self-loathing over what they felt they had to do. Their home was the pristine castle, the place where they could exercise the part of themselves they most wanted others to believe they were. For example, they swore freely in the bars and ogled half-naked women, but did not swear at home. They had sex all over the place away from home, but the members of their home life were to be faithful. They killed, lied, and stole without compunction, but this is not an acceptable part of their family man identity. While these men had a supreme ability to compartmentalize, to be psychopathic in one venue but caring and good in another, their families were also viewed as idealized extensions of a part of themselves. It was another area of control. Family members, especially wives, were not allowed to be people in their own right. They were to play a role that suited the mobster's purpose. Albert felt some of this and was largely protected, but his father ended up bringing him partly into the Cosa Nostra, our thing, by introducing him to members of the notorious crime crew and by asking him to learn to use a gun, potentially for criminal purposes. He did not witness a dismemberment, and he often underestimated the potential for brutality in someone he met at the Gemini lounge. So it came as a shock to him to learn more about his father's activities via other reports. According to his reaction, he did not quite believe the full story. After Roy was found dead in the trunk of his Cadillac, the very thing that he most wanted to prevent happened. His family suffered for his crimes. His wife, finally brought into public awareness through media stories, ultimately sold the dream house into which Roy had moved his family, while Albert spiraled into a deep suicidal depression, which he documents in detail in his revealing memoir. Mafia life had been far from glamorous, he writes, and despite the fine clothing, nice cars, and high standard of living, Roy had inflicted a lot of psychological damage on the people around him. Albert had realized by the age of 10 that his father's occupation was different, and unlike other kids, he had nothing much to share at school. He knew that his father carried a gun and kept odd hours. As the years passed, tension mounted and his father became increasingly more paranoid. He was away from the family more, and he gave the adolescent Albert charge of protecting his mother and sisters, and even took him on a few jobs. It was a poor legacy to hand down. When Albert was only 15, Roy enlisted him in a plan to fake his death, should the need arise. When Roy was killed 2 years later, Albert had to identify his body and avoid the FBI's intense scrutiny. Seeking revenge, he was nearly killed. Eventually, his life fell apart, his wife left, and he was faced with the realization that his father's life of crime had taken a terrible toll. He would not forget the bloody fate to which his father's crimes had consigned him, the body in the morgue, the crime scene photos, the photographs of victims. It was only after he read Murder Machine that he understood how truly brutal the man he adored could be. He also learned from an insider about the intimate betrayal within the family that had brought his father down, just as Roy DeMeo had done to Chris Rosenberg. Fearing that Roy might become a cooperating witness for the government, Castellano had ordered Nino to take care of him. Nino was a man whom Roy trusted, so when Nino invited him one day for a meeting, he went. Nino met him, along with the Gemini twins. Roy took off his leather jacket, and Nino fired at his head. He was hit 7 times, including the symbolic bullets that the twins put into his skull, behind the ears. Then they put him into the trunk of his car, placed the chandelier over him that he was taking to get repaired, and parked him at the club in Sheepshed Bay, Brooklyn. The government had lost Roy DeMeo as a witness, but they had not lost Nino or Paul. They continued to look for evidence against these men. Nino was arrested in 1984 and released on bail. He was eventually convicted of a conspiracy to steal cars and sentenced to 5 years. On these same charges, Joey Testa, Anthony Center, the Gemini twins, were acquitted. Then they were all brought up, along with the other crew members, on multiple counts of murder. Before the trial was over, Nino, 62, died in prison. The others were convicted. Eventually, thanks to a bug in Castellano's home and surveillance photos of a meeting of the heads of the crime families, the grand jury returned an indictment against everyone at the meeting, including Castellano. Before he went to trial, however, John Gotti made a power play to become head of the Gambino family by having Castellano assassinated in front of Sparks Steakhouse on December 16, 1985. When John Gotti's underboss, Sammy the Bull Gravano, testified against Gotti in the trial in which Gotti was convicted of his part in the murder of Castellano, Gravano also recalled Castellano's lack of reaction to Daimio's demise. Apparently, when one accepts the life, one accepts whatever form of death comes with it.